and welcome back. I'm Sheldon McLeod, and this is Thinking Out Loud, presented to you by SaltWire, and talking about, among other things, the housing crisis. We know that 2022 was an unprecedented year for a lot of reasons. Nova Scotia saw an incredible growth in new residents, people who came here in part because of the record we had during the pandemic for transmission of COVID, but also that as far as prices went, Nova Scotia was a relative bargain. You didn't have to ask anybody, except for the folks who were trying to buy a home who might have lived here. And that leads me to this point. The Nova Scotia Liberal Party, with a news release earlier today, Liberals call for faster action on Houston's housing plan. In an already heated housing market, housing starts in the province are expected to decrease this year, leaving few options for Nova Scotians who are dealing with the housing crisis, as we've just described it. And to look perhaps a little bit into why that came about, it was a report from the Canadian Mortgage Housing Authority, and CMHC put out its market outlook earlier today from the chief economist, deputy chief economist, and it does look through all of the major cities in the country, including Halifax. And then you look here, new home construction expected to slow down. That is a part of what we're talking about. Low inventory of homes and relative affordability will keep home prices up. So let's talk a little bit more about that with Nova Scotia Liberal Party's housing shadow minister. Braedon Clark is joining us. He's MLA for Bedford South, and he's here on the line with us from Halifax. Good day to you.
Thanks, Sheldon. Thanks for having me.
No problem. Curious, when you saw the numbers from CMHC, what is it that raised alarm bells for you?
Well, I would say two things. One on the home ownership side and one on the rental side, which of course are connected, obviously, when it comes to housing overall. So first and foremost, as you mentioned, new housing starts in Halifax are expected to be down this year as compared to last year, depending on ranges, of course, maybe 10 to 20%, as high as that. So that's a huge problem because we know that the population in the city is growing quickly, both from other parts of Canada and other parts of the world. And if housing is slowing down, we are actually perpetuating the cycle of the housing crisis, pushing prices up, having less supply. And the government talks about supply as being kind of the magic bullet, the solution to the housing crisis. And I agree, it's obviously hugely important to have more supply, but the numbers are showing that we're not keeping up. And that's going to be a huge problem going forward. And on the rental side, obviously, we all know that there's a rent cap in place now through to the end of 2025. Next 2 years, it's going to be 5% increases allowable. But the CMHC report that you mentioned in the opening there is suggesting that average rents in HRM for a two-bedroom will be up between 6 and 7% over the next 2 years. So by 2025, if you're renting a two-bedroom apartment, you're going to be paying on average about $1,750. So to me, there's not a ton of good news, unfortunately, on the housing side, either on home ownership or on the rental market side.
So if we take a look at that little graph that they put up, talking about rental units under construction, it's looking like there's still growth in that area. Yeah. But as you say, rental units completed, it's still trailing, but it's still higher in 2023 than it has been for the last number of years. And that whole compounded problem of people are perhaps stuck renting if they can't afford a house. Interest rates are high. And this seems like a bunch of things all came together at once. So how is it specifically government's responsibility for somehow failing to increase housing starts, single family dwellings?
Well, if you look, for example, at the special planning areas, which is something that this current PC government announced a little over a year ago, March of last year, they designated 9 areas within HRM to essentially fast track housing development, arguing that through the existing municipal process, homes weren't being built quickly enough. And I do think there was some merit to that argument. But over the past year on those special planning areas, there hasn't been a lot of construction. There hasn't been a lot of homes being built. 3 of those planning areas are in my riding of Bedford South. and there hasn't been a single home completed at that time. And not only has there not been homes completed, there hasn't been any earth moved. There's signs up at some of these locations saying we're going to have 1,000 units here. We're going to have 1,500 units here, but there's no one living there yet. And so I think the government's main argument, as I said, has been we need more supply. And I don't dispute that, but I don't think their efforts to get single family home construction moving is working so far. And single family is not obviously for everybody. It's not the solution for everybody, but it's part of the mix. And as you said, Sheldon, all of these things are connected. And if one piece is not working, it has a trickle down effect to the rest of the system, where if you move here and you want to buy a house, but either there's no homes available or the supply is so low that you can't afford the house, then you're renting. And then that means somebody else isn't able to rent. And it trickles down to the street level, where we see, huge increases in homelessness in the city as well, right? So it's all very connected.
I saw a quote by a professor emerita of planning from Dalhousie, who said in some ways it's in the best interest of development companies to not rush to build homes, because that keeps the prices higher. Mm-hmm. That and the fact that we have, a market where, as I alluded to, that Nova Scotia was relatively cheap compared to the rest of the country. So it was cheaper for people to buy a home than it was to build a home. And I don't know where that level, how will that equalize? What is it that Braedon is suggesting and the Liberal Party of Nova Scotia is suggesting to deal with those kinds of complex issues?
Yeah, so we, in the previous House session, which ended about two to 3 weeks ago, middle of April, I introduced two pieces of legislation on housing. By comparison, the government, no legislation on housing, no obvious moves on housing, I would say. And our pieces, beyond the rent cap, I should say, our pieces would have extended the rent cap until the housing market was healthy, would have allowed for more capital investment for homeowners who wanted to put in, secondary suites, granny suites, as they might be called, backyard suites for more housing options, making more small landlords eligible for things like home energy rebates. So if you're a landlord who owns, let's say, 4 units, making you eligible to install heat pumps, for example, on all of those units, which is obviously good for tenants and is good for property owners as well, because small landlords in particular are struggling with the rent cap. And I appreciate that, because costs are very, very high, whether it's, oil or electricity, insurance, all those costs are going through the roof. So we think something needs to be done on that piece. And to be fair, the housing issue is not just a provincial issue, obviously. The municipality has a key role to play as the primary development approver. And then the federal government has a key role to play in terms of a lot of funding. But unfortunately, I think the province over the last 20 to 30 years, and that's all parties over that time period, have neglected their role in housing, I think, under the assumption, as you said, that our housing market is healthy, it's affordable, we don't really need to stick our toes into that water. But things change so quickly, basically from the time of the pandemic, surprising everybody. But I think we need to catch up as a province really, really quickly and invest significantly more money than we do, particularly on the non-market housing side. Affordable housing, public housing, cooperative housing. We need to really say the province needs to do something at a much larger scale than it currently is. Otherwise, we're not going to get ahead of this curve if our population trends continue, which it seems like they are going to.
And that CMHC report also points out that landlord costs are increasing, and that perhaps signing new leases, they're going to go for the top dollar, anticipating perhaps an extension of the rent cap. And let's go back in time to when all provincial governments decided they were going to give rent subsidies instead of actually building homes and building construction. And you alluded to that. Is the Liberal Party of Nova Scotia interested in getting into building homes for that particular reason? Cooperative homes, community homes, homes for people who might not otherwise be able to afford it.
Yeah, I think there's a major role for the province to play in that, and whether that takes the form of, public housing, for example, whether that takes the form of cooperative housing or simply providing funding to incentivize a developer to offer affordable housing. And one of the challenges is that we don't really have a consistent or great definition of what affordable housing even is. CMHC says it's 30% of your income or more on housing. But if you look at the rent supplement program in Nova Scotia, for example, you have to spend 50% now, 50% of your income or more on housing to even be eligible. And that's a recent change that the government made, I think was a huge mistake, because now you've got people in this province who are spending 48% of their income on housing, and they're not eligible. So whatever form, to answer your question, whatever form the housing takes, I think the province needs to invest a lot more money than they currently are. And just to give your listeners a sense of the scale here, the provincial budget is about $14 billion or so total. And the budget for the housing component of housing and municipal affairs, because it's two departments together, is about $200 million. So of a $14 billion budget, we're spending $200 million on housing. And housing is the number 2 issue in this province behind healthcare. So I think we need to be spending a lot more money on housing, or we're never going to get ahead of it. We can't just stick our heads in the sand and assume that things will go back to the way they were in 2019 and before that, because I just don't see that happening. I see it in my riding in particular. We've got people moving here from all over the world, every corner of the world, Morocco, Nigeria, China, the United States, all parts of Europe. And these people are professionals. They have young families. They're entrepreneurs. They're doing great things. But the thing I hear over and over again is, I have nowhere to live. I didn't think it would be like this. Rent is too high, or housing prices are too high. And people who come here, who immigrate here, don't have deep ties to the region yet. So I've heard many people say to me, well, look, I can move. I've got relatives who live in Montreal, or I've got friends who live in Edmonton or Regina, places that are more affordable, to be honest, at this point, from a housing perspective. So we risk losing some of our, best and brightest who are coming here if we don't get a handle on housing sooner rather than later.
I guess the last question, and again, in that CMHC report, it points out that housing starts are going to be challenged by labor, that having enough people to build the homes. Last year it was materials, this year it's people. So what's your solution?
Yeah, that's a really difficult one, to be honest with you. And I don't think anybody knows exactly how to solve that just yet. I know the government is trying to do some things on the tax side, for example. So, making tradespeople eligible for no income tax up to $50,000 and so on. And we'll see if that works. But I also think we need to be looking at expanding, skilled trades programs at places like NSCC and so on, making apprenticeships, making sure that requirements work. So there's ratios that might be out of date on the apprenticeship side, to make sure that, if you want to be a Red Seal carpenter or plumber or electrician, instead of taking 24 months to get into the job force, maybe it takes 18 or 12. And that's a huge thing, because, from my office here, I'm looking at a crane in an apartment building that's about half done along the waterfront here. And we see cranes everywhere, but it's really, when you see those cranes, you can think that everything's going great. But the shocking fact of the matter is that there's just not enough skilled labor, as you say. Even though we're working at max capacity, we've heard from builders and developers that they're working at 100%, and until they get more people in these positions, they're not going to be able to expand and to do more projects, which is a huge problem, because people aren't going to stop coming here.
I think we have to start to at least celebrate the people who are getting things done and take away some of the perhaps the social, I don't know what you would call it, stigma. That's not probably the right word, but how we perhaps don't put enough value in the people who work with their hands. If you ever needed a contractor in the last 2 years, you know how challenging that is. So Braedon, thank you for taking some time this afternoon to share your thoughts. Anything else before we go?
No, I just want to say that I think housing, I think there can be a sense that it was a temporary thing, the pandemic. Lots of people moved here from Ontario or other places, as you said, where it seemed affordable. I just think that housing is going to be an issue beyond the life of this government and well into this decade. So the sooner we can work together as a province, municipality, and federal level to make sure that we have enough homes and we have enough homes that people can afford to live in, then we're going to unlock even more of the potential that we're seeing in the city and in the province.
Braedon Clark is the Bedford South MLA. He's also the Housing Shadow Minister for the Liberal Party. Thank you.
Thanks, Sheldon.